Jacques Louis David, Radical Draftsman, is the first international loan show devoted to David's drawings, and it includes 84 works, both from the Met's own collection and from 37 lenders from 7 different countries. We've chosen works to represent the full extent of his career, from his early training to his old age spent in exile in Brussels. David's life spanned a period of multiple upheavals and transformations of French society. He was born and trained in the very late Rococo period under the monarchy, and in 1789 witnessed the first events of the French Revolution and the founding of the French Republic in 1792. But that was just the first of many upheavals. His whole life and career played out in the context of momentous political and social change. These events were not mere background to a career. For David, to be a painter was to be a public figure. His work addressed a wide audience and had a broad impact. We chose to focus the exhibition on David's works on paper for 2 reasons. 1, because it had never been done before, and 2, because of the role they played in his artistic process. David had no interest in the commodification of his drawings. He made them to keep for himself and to study, to remember, and to work out ideas in endless iterations. They were part of his studio practice in a way that we might consider private. But it is for this reason that we feel they have so much to reveal. They were made not to please others or to sell, but to work out ideas and to further his art. I'm excited to bring all these works together because they recreate the processes of David's work, his inspirations and the revisions that lay the groundwork for all the masterpieces that we're familiar with. His drawings reveal the struggle and the trial and error, the epiphanies, and allow us, I believe, to understand the artist on a deeper level, and perhaps a more human level. By organizing a show around his sketches and studies, we can present his career in the fullest way possible, from beginning to end, from private struggle to public triumph and back again. This sheet is one of the small number of drawings that survive from David's years of training in Paris. Drawings like this posed study of a male nude were a standard part of artistic training in this period, more specifically for male artists aspiring to be history painters. We see here, in the way the form is modeled in black and white chalk, a clear understanding of anatomy and mastery of technique. But beyond that, sheets like this offer up few hints of the artist David would become. The first opportunity for reinvention in David's career came during the 5 years he spent in Rome. Here, in a recently discovered sheet, he draws a posed male nude with an impressive sense of volume and a convincing rendering of light and shadow over the model's tensed muscles as he reclines on a platform. But David's true education, we can say, with the benefit of hindsight, came not in the classroom, but by roaming the streets of Rome, sketchbook in hand. These sketches, which number over 1,000, tend to be small and schematic. He draws quickly to get the essence. His strongest interest in making all these drawings, judging from the numbers alone, seems to have been antique sculpture and sculpted reliefs. He seems drawn to the clarity and the purity of antique sculptures and the stories that they tell. What is most telling, though, as to the intent that powered David's 5-year sketching campaign was what he did with his sketchbooks upon returning to Paris in 1780. He basically cut them all apart, taking drawings made in different places at different times, and pasted them into large albums according to type. For instance, he collected all of his drawings of women seated or reclining in poses of grief. Later, when he wanted to depict such a figure for one of his own paintings, he could easily flip through and consult examples of classical prototypes. The drawings in these albums would provide the building blocks of the neoclassical style and would stay in David's studio throughout his career. You can even see in the kind of worn edges of the paper how frequently these were consulted and used by David and by his students. And he often would choose just a certain figure or motif to excerpt from something larger. And in these choices, you really get insight into what interests him as an artist. The picture that really established David's reputation and his place as leader of the French school was the Oath of the Horacii. The painting, still famous today, hangs in the Louvre, but through these studies we can see the circuitous route by which he arrived at his composition and the many false starts along the way. The picture was a commission from the French king, and the subject David was assigned involved the story of a dispute between the ancient tribes of the Romans and the Albans, which was to be settled by two sets of brothers fighting each other. When the Horacii returned victorious and were met by the grief of their sister, Camilla, who had been engaged to marry one of the brothers from the other tribe, Horatius, in anger, raised his sword and killed her. David made a number of drawings exploring the murder and its aftermath, but in the end must have found them all unsavory. Ultimately, he decided to change course and depict not the gruesome murder, but the patriotic oath that he envisioned taking place before the brothers left for battle. This preference for showing the prelude or aftermath rather than a scene of graphic violence would become a lifelong habit. The flip side of his avoidance of scenes of blood and gore was David's deep engagement with psychological complexity. He's very attracted to the idea of patriotism, of brotherhood, but he does not see it in a vacuum. He always sees the human cost and the suffering and the dynamic of the family and how it isn't always aligned with the dynamic of the state. And that is a theme that carries throughout his oeuvre. When David had his compositions almost fully worked out, as a final stage, he would pose live models and he would make these large chalk studies to study the fall of light on drapery. And they're beautifully wrought drawings, but what's really fascinating about them to me is how little attention he pays to the faces, the hands, the feet, and he allows the drapery, the pose as expressed through the drapery, to carry the weight of the emotion that he wants to express. In the years just before the French Revolution, David was working on a painting of Paris and Helen for the younger brother of the king. Paris's abduction of Helen was a catalyst for the decade-long Trojan War, but here, in one of David's early studies for the painting, military attributes take a backseat to love. As so often with David, we are in a space of psychological ambiguity. As David made progress in working out a composition, he would often make a small-scale oil sketch where he would try out the palette and light effects he intended to use in the final painting. In this sketch, soft fabrics and gilt ornament are added to the decor. In the finished painting, the color of almost every object is different. Paris's hat goes from blue to red, the fabric backdrop from red to blue, but what stays constant is the sense of natural daylight, flooding the scene and giving the figures a glowing luminosity. The number of iterations reveals first that his personality is somewhat of a perfectionist, but also I would say that he has a certain order of working on things. He thinks about different aspects of a picture in sequence, not all at once. He often focuses first on the figural grouping, the poses of the figures, and then he starts to fill in the setting. He will often go back to his notebooks and try out different pieces of ancient furniture, different colors, and he will tinker with smaller and smaller bits of the picture to make it expressive and nuanced. And when you see all these drawings of him changing bit by bit by bit and experimenting, it's no accident the power and depth of his finished paintings. The Death of Socrates is the one large-scale finished painting in the show because it is a centerpiece in the Met's collection. One of the greatest neoclassical paintings in North America, it normally hangs in the Met's galleries of European painting, but is included in our exhibition alongside a grouping of drawings that show, in effect, the picture's origin story. From sheet to sheet, in a process begun years before he received a commission, the visitor can follow the twists and the turns, the ideas and the edits that eventually led to this powerful painting. It depicts the final moments of the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates. He has been found guilty of corrupting the youth of Athens with his teachings and is offered the choice of renouncing his beliefs or drinking poison. He chooses the latter, but before taking the goblet, he pauses to reassure his followers, explaining his belief in the immortality of the soul. In this quickly executed sketch, we can see already the core of the idea. Against the backdrop of a stone wall, an old man sits upright on a bed, his hand held up indicating the heavens. But on this sheet, which came to light only a few years ago, David set down on paper a rush of new ideas. He adds a barrel-vaulted hallway on the left as a way to include the prior scene where Socrates' family departs. But towards the center of the sheet, we can see what decisions David most struggled with. The arms and legs of Socrates and the arm of the cupbearer are all drawn multiple times in different overlapping positions as the artist sought to find the arrangement of limbs that would most effectively tell his story. This drawing shows a stage of the artist's thinking that we previously hadn't known. Although it's one of the messiest sheets in the show, for me, those are the most exciting because they show the thoughts in the process of developing. You can really see in the very center of this sketch what he most struggled with, and that is the placement of Socrates' arm relative to the goblet of poison. And he keeps adjusting the limbs of Socrates, and it's a thing he's really focused on. It's a thing that will be central to the finished painting. All of David's thinking about the placement of limbs and the cups have here been resolved, and you see this vignette at the very center of the canvas where Socrates' hand hovers above the cup of poison, and it is the crux of this incredibly powerful painting is in the exact placement of those limbs. The French Revolution brought a sea change not only to French society but also to every aspect of the arts. David was far from a neutral bystander, and he now threw his talents into celebrating the revolution and the young republic, its triumphs and its martyrs. His most ambitious project was a depiction of the oath of the tennis court, a critical event in the early phase of the revolution. The painting was never completed, but the large-scale preparatory study is one of David's greatest achievements as a draftsman. On June 20th, 1789, representatives of a broad swath of French society gathered and pledged to write a constitution. Their pledge takes the form of an oath, and it's hard not to see here echoes of the oath of the Horacii. But here the number of participants is vastly expanded, and they are now portraits of recognizable contemporary figures. He begins with a sketchbook and with making many studies of individual figures. After that stage, he will start to group them into groupings and start to study the fall of light and make them more three-dimensional. You'll see he even scribbles notes to himself on this sheet of paper. He even cuts out pieces to make corrections. And from there, he takes the next step and he will assemble them into this larger scene that he has orchestrated. He's working almost like he's the director of a film. He starts by choosing his actors, choosing their costumes, and then doing take after take until he achieves what is really his final vision for the scene. What is most striking on first encounter is that the artist has done an about-face in terms of subject matter. He has gone from depicting legends and history of ancient Rome to depicting very recent events with real people, many of whom he knew. But when you look at the drawings, you see that actually his approach is not completely different. He is doing many of the same things by starting with drawing nude figures before adding clothes. He is now approaching contemporary times like a history painter to underscore the momentousness of the occasion. Art, in many ways, became a tool to support the revolution. This drawing shows David's friend, JeanPaul Mara, the political activist who was stabbed to death in his own bathtub by a royalist sympathizer. David memorialized the event in a painting, but also made this much more intimate depiction as the model for a print. He uses the dense network of ink lines to model his friend's face. Lit from the left, Mara's head tilts right toward the shadow. His eyes are open only a slit, his lips barely parted. He's portrayed as if between life and death, slipping away as we watch. It's never easy to wholly separate David, the man, and David, the artist and the public figure. His life and his art overlap to such a degree. He's memorializing Marat as a martyr of the revolution to support the revolutionary causes and to bring out sympathy, but he was also a friend, and he also saw him the night before he died. So this drawing is just one of many examples of how he brings his personal experience to his art. In the third gallery, we come to one of the most haunting sections of the exhibition. In 1794, Robespierre, who had led the bloody period known as the Terror, was executed, and many of his friends and allies, David among them, were imprisoned. In prison and with his fate uncertain, David made a series of portraits of his fellow political prisoners. They are small, round, bust-length portraits with their subjects shown in profile. The format was meant to evoke ancient coins and medallions, so by choosing this format for his fellow former deputies now in prison, he is emphasizing their official roles. He's not seeing them as victimized individuals, but as leaders and men of principle. At the same time, though, they are unflinching in their naturalism. The men put on a brave face, feeling perhaps that they were posing for posterity. But notice the small details, their slightly disheveled clothing, their fixed stares, the tightness with which they cross their arms. David captures their anxiety so viscerally, perhaps because he felt it himself. Following his release from prison, David felt the need to repair his reputation. He began to explore new ideas for history paintings, choosing to depict the intervention of the Ceban women, a tale from ancient Rome. The Ceban women were abducted by the men of a neighboring tribe, and this is the episode that is most often depicted by artists. David depicts an event that took place 3 years later when their fathers and brothers returned to battle their captors. But the Ceban women stepped between the two warring factions to put a stop to the bloodshed and urge reconciliation. It is notable that the subject David chose is not a call to war, but a call to peace. It was a time when the French nation was in need of healing, when it had itself been divided into factions, and the choice of this subject signaled David's interest in reconciliation. The last years of the 18th century saw the gradual rise to power of the young general Napoleon Bonaparte, who sought to expand French territory and power, and by 1804 had crowned himself emperor. He led the country in a very different direction from the egalitarian ideals of the revolutionary period. David, whatever his true feelings, must have come to the realization that if he wanted to retain his position as France's leading painter and to receive important commissions, he had no choice but to ally himself with Napoleon. To memorialize and spread word of his expanding power, Napoleon commissioned David to make a series of very large-scale canvases depicting events around the imperial coronation. One that he was particularly anxious to have was a scene where the military pledged allegiance to the newly crowned emperor. One highlight of the exhibition is this recently discovered oil sketch for the painting. The ceremony it depicts took place on the steps of the large military academy in central Paris. Napoleon stands on the top step, his arm extended toward the mass of soldiers who rush up the steps toward him. David is presenting a powerful tableau of military allegiance, not exactly as it happened, but according to his own design and choreography, a historical record molded to the desires of the patron. These large-scale commissions came with strings attached, and it is in this era, more than at any earlier point in his career, that David had to be responsive to the patron's wishes. We can see with IR images the chalk drawings and previous versions below what we see. Napoleon had David excise the figure of Josephine, whom he had divorced earlier that year, and he had him delete an allegorical figure of victory in the sky because he did not want allegory in his military paintings. So there's very much a push and pull between artist and patron here that is revealed even further in the underlayers of this sketch. In the late years of the empire, from about 1810 to 1815, Napoleon was often away on military campaigns, and official commissions for David dried up. When this happened, David would return, as was always his natural inclination, to stories of the classical past. This is one of David's studies for Leonidas at Thermopylae, a subject he had begun making sketches for over a decade earlier. Leonidas was a Spartan king, a figure who had been keenly admired by the Jacobins, a revolutionary group of which David had been a member. Leonidas led his warriors into battle, knowing they were greatly outnumbered by the army of the Persian king Xerxes. True to form, David would not depict the battlefield where they would all soon perish, but instead shows us the noble resolve and deep patriotism that preceded the battle. There is an anecdote relayed by one of David's students that years earlier, the young Napoleon had visited David's studio and had seen sketches for the subject and admonished the artist, saying, quote, "You are wrong, David, to put your energy into portraying the vanquished." There is considerable irony then in David's return to the subject over a decade later, when military defeats were mounting for Napoleon and the mood in the French capital had turned dark. As David neared 70, one more great political shift took place. Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo and the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy made his position in his homeland untenable. He would live out the final decade of his life in Brussels. His life there was not uncomfortable, but the relationship between his art and his identity was dramatically transformed. This shift is nowhere more evident than in his drawings. In this sheet, done in the second year of his exile, we recognize Leonidas and various supporting figures from that composition, but now they are cropped fragments, fused into a single conglomeration with no setting or context. For an artist who worked his whole life to achieve clarity and legibility in his narrative, it is disconcerting to see him let go of all that and to show the emotion of the figures, these faces clearly expressive, but without a story. These late drawings really stand out from everything he did, everything you saw earlier in the show. The figures are cropped, we are very close to them, and yet there is still a disorienting sense. It's almost as if David at this stage is haunted by the characters and the memories of the career that led up to this. It is our hope that this show will allow you to see David both at his moments of triumph and his periods of struggle, and to see what binds them together. Walking through these galleries and following decades of change in David's art and life against the backdrop of French history allows us to appreciate the resilience of an artist who always had both the present and posterity in mind.
A project like this one requires incredible effort across every department of the Met, and I'd like to thank the many friends and colleagues involved, especially of course Perrin Stein, the exhibition's curator. We are also grateful to the donors to the exhibition for their phenomenal support, including the Eugene V. and Claire E. Thaw Charitable Trust, the Margaret and Richard Riney Family Foundation, and the Schiff Foundation. Additional thanks are also owed to the Drew E. Heitz Fund, the Tavolazza Foundation, and Hubert and Morel Goldschmidt for helping us bring its wonderful publication to life.